Welcome back to Sports Cards once again. In our last video, we looked at NBA players throughout the decades whose cards will likely forever remain valuable throughout the twists and turns of time. Players whose influence on the league have been etched in stone and whose memory will never fade through the annals of sports history. In this video, we'll be looking at currently active players and reflecting on what players from this generation of NBA greats will be able to reach this coveted pinnacle of greatness that so few ever do. By doing so, we hope to identify players whose cards may be worth investing in as long-term investments, not just for short-term quick flips. That being said, some of them might also have cards that are better options for the shorter term, so we will consider that as well in this analysis. If you're interested in retired players and Hall of Famers to consider for long-term investments, please do check out our last video. And please do subscribe to this channel for lots of great basketball card-related content. Now, even though in our last video we did look at some of the older players currently active in the league, for the purposes of this video, we'll be looking at all active players, starting with the older ones and moving forwards towards the babies. We'll start this exploration with a couple of players from the 2003-2004 draft class. First up, LeBron James. So we already talked about LeBron James in our last video, and I don't think we need to discuss him much here. It's clear that his cards will forever be valuable. I mean, him, Kobe, and MJ are the big three in the basketball card market, really. No need to even hesitate about assuming that. In the short term, it is not as clear of an answer as to whether his cards are good short-term investments. His cards are likely to still have some ups and downs, some ebbs and flows, based on his play on the court and how well the Lakers do this year. If he stays injury-free and his Lakers do what they're supposed to do and dominate, then his cards are likely also good short-term investments as well as long-term. But other than maybe Michael Jordan, there's really no safer bet when it comes to long-term investments. Next up, from the same draft class, we have Carmelo Anthony. Now, Anthony's cards are actually very inexpensive, very inexpensive. That being said, I think he has had enough of an impact on the league that even if his cards do remain forever somewhat low, they will almost certainly never dip below where they already are. As such, I think his cards are a safe evergreen bet. What I mean by evergreen is they'll always have some sort of value. From the 2005-2006 draft class, Chris Paul. Chris Paul is definitely someone who has historic significance in the league and whose cards will always be relevant in the hobby in some ways, well after his retirement. That being said, I don't necessarily see his cards really ever going up that much in value in the long term. I say this because it seems that is the case for other historic players of his ilk, such as John Stockton, Jason Kidd, Steve Nash. Paul is right up there among some of the greatest point guards in NBA history, just like those three, and his cards will likely forever remain somewhat valuable and sought after by a number of collectors. But just like Stockton, Kidd, and Nash, I don't think his cards will ever really go up too significantly either. However, if his Suns team can make another run for the championship, and if they actually can manage to win a championship, then I think his cards would shoot up significantly for the short term, making them potentially good short-term investments, and I think that would also help the long term. As such, I think his cards are worth considering buying, as they're likely forever somewhat valuable, and if the Suns do great this year, then they're great for short and long term. From the 2007-2008 draft class, we have Kevin Durant. Now, other than LeBron James, I don't think there is a more safe bet for long-term relevance in the basketball card conversation than Kevin Durant, as far as current players are concerned. He has cemented himself as an all-time great already, and he still has time to continue to add to his legacy. Some of his more iconic and unique cards do have a very expensive entry point at this point in his career, but if you're able to get a hold of them for a good deal, I don't see how they could ever be a bad investment. For short-term investments, I also think his cards are a good buy. His Nets team seem well positioned to make a championship run, and Durant will inevitably be in the media spotlight all year. So if the Nets do what they're supposed to do, I would imagine his cards would also be increasing in value in the short term. And he's just too good for his cards to ever really take much of a dip, pretty much no matter what happens. So for both short and long-term card investment, I think Durant is a great choice. From the 2008-2009 draft class, Russell Westbrook. Whatever your thoughts are about Russell Westbrook, there is no doubt that he has established himself as a very important part of NBA history. As such, his cards will likely forever be sought by a number of collectors. For the short term, I think he also has the chance to be a good choice for flipping. I say this because no matter where Westbrook is, he is always in the spotlight. But now that he's on the Lakers, that spotlight is just going to be magnified. Due to this, I think he could be a perfect candidate for quick and frequent flips this year. But for those that are more iconic or unique, I think they are also safe for long-term investments as well. From the 2009-2010 draft class. Now, the first to mention from this draft class, no question, Steph Curry. Of all the currently active players, no one has changed the league as much as Curry. From a historical perspective, he is one of the most important players in league history. How many people have had such a wide-scale impact on how people play the game? Practically no one else besides Curry. Due to this, there is almost no one who is a safer long-term investment than Curry among all active players, except for LeBron James and possibly Kevin Durant. Although Curry might even be a safer long-term investment than even Durant. In the short term, I wouldn't necessarily be going out to load up on his cards for any kind of short-term flips at this moment, as I don't really see the Warriors doing that well this year. As such, I don't think his cards will really be doing much in the short term, but for the long term, they're pretty much guaranteed to forever be valuable. The other player from this same draft class to make the list is James Harden. He's one of the very best offensive players of this generation. He will certainly continue to be part of the basketball conversation for well beyond his years in the league, and as such, his cards seem like good long-term investments. For the short term, I think they're also wise investments. His Nets team will certainly be in the spotlight all year long, and if he can get back to the MVP caliber play he had before his injury last season, then I think his cards will see a lot of growth during this year. That being said, if the Nets decide to be extra careful and sit out their superstars a lot to keep them fresh for the playoffs, then not only would that be annoying, I think it'd also prevent Harden's cards from doing as much this year as they potentially could. Next up, we have the 2011-2012 draft class, where we have the 15th pick in the draft, Kawhi Leonard. As a two-time Finals MVP and one of the best players in the NBA for a number of years, he has already established a very strong long-term legacy. For the short term, there is something to reflect on here as well. While I don't think I would be buying up a bunch right now, I would probably be keeping a close eye on what goes on with his card prices while he is out with his current injury. If I saw the price trending downward, I probably would buy a bunch at some point, just waiting for his return, when they'd likely shoot back up to at least where they are now, likely much higher. Now, while Kawhi is the only one from this draft class that I feel certain about that has cemented his long-term legacy, there are two other names from this draft class that could also possibly be considered for a list like this: Kyrie Irving and Klay Thompson. However, I'm not including them on this list because I don't think they quite have done enough to really have a forever legacy the likes of others on this list. Kyrie is one of the most skilled players ever, as well as one of the most fun to watch, but he's never really been good enough to even be able to be the best player on a good team. So I don't think he quite makes the cut for this category. Klay Thompson as well, even though he's one of the most underrated superstars in the league today, I don't think his long-term legacy will be strong enough to keep his cards evergreen, quite like Curry's or Durant's, unfortunately. His contribution to the Warriors dynasty is extremely important, but I still don't think it'll keep his cards necessarily evergreen quite like the others on this list. While I consider him a superstar, I think history will see him as a really important star, and there is a difference there. He's the Joe Dumars to Steph Curry's Isaiah Thomas. Alright, on to the 2012-13 draft class. The first to mention for this list is Anthony Davis. I've even heard respected analysts consider him as a candidate for the greatest power forward of all time. Now, while I wouldn't go that far, I do think he has already established for himself a very solid long-term legacy, and as such, his cards will likely forever hold value. I would actually suggest that they're quite undervalued right now, but I don't think they will be for long. I have a feeling that for the short term, his cards are among some of the safest bets there are, especially with the continued relevance of the Lakers in the championship hunt. And for the long term, I also think they only will be solid long-term investments. I would actually put Anthony Davis's cards among some of the best investments possible right now. Now, besides Anthony Davis, there's actually several players from this draft class that are right on the edge of being on a list like this. But as it now stands, I don't think any of them actually would make the cut if they were to retire right now. The first one to mention here, and the one who I most want to actually be on this list, is Damien Lillard. Now, I think Dame Dollar is one of the greatest point guards of this generation, and he just so happens to be my very favorite player on my favorite team. However, though he will certainly forever be remembered as a premier point guard, I don't think his legacy is deep enough to yet get his cards in that coveted evergreen status. That being said, he still does have time to change that during the last few years of his career, so he does have the potential to be on this list a little later down the road, and I hope he makes it. The other two names to mention from this draft class who don't quite make the cut are Bradley Beal and Draymond Green. Beal, despite the fact that he has had more than 30 points per game in the past 2 seasons, and very likely might have another couple of them before he's finished, even in the middle of his prime years, he has very undervalued basketball cards. His rookie cards cost very little compared to many of his all-star contemporaries, and I just don't think he's cemented himself a strong enough legacy to keep his cards evergreen beyond his career, at least currently. Draymond Green, on the other hand, does have a pretty strong legacy as a key member of the Warriors dynasty, but as the fourth name behind Curry, Durant, and Klay, there just really isn't much chance Draymond's cards stay valuable for the long term. Plus, he's mostly defense, and defensive players rarely have valuable basketball cards. From the 2013-2014 draft class, there is one name that rises above all others easily: Giannis Antetokounmpo. He has already, at a very young age, solidified himself as one of the all-time greats. His NBA resume looks like something a first-ballot Hall of Famer would be lucky to have upon retirement, and he's still only 26 years old. The value of his cards, I think, will be very good for the long term. Not to mention, he's only shown growth from year to year in the league, so I think we have a lot more to see from this recently crowned NBA champion. As we move forward into the 2014-2015 draft class, we are getting into the territory where a lot of speculation is required. The players from here on forward are all still very young, and as such, it's impossible to know exactly what the direction of their career will be. Nonetheless, I will do my best to make some projections based on what we do know at this point in time, and state who I think will be on this list when their time comes. So don't get it twisted, I'm not putting anybody here on an all-time great list. I'm saying they have the potential to become on this list later. The first name to mention from this draft class who has a very good shot at being on this list once he's been in the league a bit longer is the Joker, Nikola Jokic. Now at first, it would seem like a league MVP would be a shoo-in for this list, but actually I think it's a little more complicated than that. The Joker is either the first or second best big man in the game today, but it's hard to say whether he could ever be held in the same breath as bigs like David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, etc. And that's what would be required of him to make this list at the center position. It's hard to have evergreen basketball cards for people at the center position. I think that if Jokic can keep his teams at least within the championship hunt for many years, then he will be on this list though. But that is a big ask. The next name to mention is the other best big man in the game today, Joel Embiid. In order for Embiid to make this list, first and foremost, he will have to remain healthy long term. Secondly, he'll have to prove that he can take a good team beyond the second round of the playoffs consistently. At the moment, he doesn't have any accolades to make his legacy long lasting, but he has the talent and skill to definitely do that. I feel slightly less confident in Embiid than I do in Jokic, but in many ways, both of them have the same requirements in the upcoming years if either of them are to eventually be considered all-time greats whose basketball cards are forever valued. They have to show their contribution to winning at a very high level consistently. Moving on to the 2015-2016 draft class, and things only get more and more towards guesswork, since these are some really young youngins here. There are two that I think have the best shot at this list depending on the trajectory of their careers. The first and most likely of the bunch, I would say, is Devin Booker. He's already established himself as one of the premier offensive threats in the league today. I mean, really, how many people this young have already had a 70-point game in the NBA? And this past year, he also proved himself to be much more than the critics who once thought of him as something of an empty stats kind of guy. He's shown himself to be a winner, and someone who can be the number one player on a contending team. This past year, it's hard to say whether him or Chris Paul was the team's number one, but Booker is still very young and will certainly be a number one of many good teams in his career. I think his cards have a good chance to be very valuable both in the short term and as long-term investments. I think he has the skill, talent, drive, and mentality to be an important part of the league for a long time. The next player from this draft class to mention is someone that I don't think will actually make the list, but he still has enough time to change that, and that is Karl Anthony Towns. Now, Cat is one of the best three-level scoring threat big men the NBA has ever seen. He's an offensive magician, but he has yet to prove he can even pull what should be a decent team out of the very, very bottom of the NBA standings. And his defense is pretty well documented as being terrible. If he doesn't contribute to significant winning in his NBA career, he will not make a list like this. But I mention him nonetheless because he is still very young, and he's young enough to turn that narrative around about his career. Now, moving on to the 2016-17 draft class, we're actually going to skip right past it. I don't think anyone from this draft class has too much of a chance to make a list like this. The one who has the best chance, I'd suggest, is Jaylen Brown, but being an all-time great shooting guard is a really big ask. I think Jaylen Brown will be an important part in the NBA for many years to come, but I don't think he'll reach that all-time status that is required for his cards to really remain evergreen long after his career is over. Let's move on to the 2017-18 draft class. And there are two major names to consider here, I think. The first is Jason Tatum. While he is still very young and has a long way to go, at the moment he is looking like he may just possibly be the premier wing in the league in just a few years' time. Once the old guard of LeBron, Durant, and Kawhi have retired, Tatum may just be the name uttered on that tier of wings in just a couple of years. As such, I think he has a very good chance to become someone who is on this list. I think his cards are good long-term investments because of that. He's also young and exciting, and as such, I think they're also good short-term investments. So I think he's a good player to get cards of. But a lot of people think that too, so his card prices have been rising. The next name to mention is one who also has a solid chance to make a list like this, but he will have to continue to grow in order to do so, and that is Donovan Mitchell. Mitchell has proven himself to be able to be the key offensive guy in a good offensive system, and he's also an excellent defender. He's also shown he has the capacity to take over games when it's necessary for him to do so. If he can do that consistently and in the playoffs in ways that bring his team a chip or two, then he'll have his long-term legacy. If he stays only as the best player in a very solid systems-oriented team like the Jazz, then he might not end up getting those individual accolades long-term, even if he does really contribute to winning in an important way. That's one tough thing about a team like the Jazz that's very team-oriented. I think it makes for better basketball, smarter basketball, but it also doesn't let the individual accolades kind of gather up so that somebody like Mitchell can end up being seen at that top tier, which is a little unfair to him because I think he has the capacity to, and I think the fact that he can work within a system like that is incredibly important. Now, on to the 2018-2019 draft class. This seems possible to be one of those draft classes that future generations look back on as one of the best. As young as some of these players are, there are solid superstars that have emerged already, and these guys are crazy young. Luka Doncic is the first to mention, of course, as the expectations for him are through the roof. But as of this far into his career, it seems that those expectations are well warranted. If the premier rookie of the 80s was MJ, of the 90s was Kobe, and of the 2000s was LeBron, is it possible that Luka takes the throne as the premier rookie of the 2010s? If you look at the basketball card market at the moment, it certainly seems as if Luka is on a trajectory to do just that. Or at least that is what basketball card collectors are expecting from him. Now that is a lot of expectation to hold up for someone who is only 22 years old, but if anyone can do it, it seems that Luka is that dude. As such, I think his rookie cards, as expensive as they are still good investments, although I'm not going to be able to afford any of those upper tier ones myself, but I think they're good for both the short and long term. The next name to mention is Trae Young. Now he is nowhere near a spot where he's cementing some long-term legacy yet. However, he proved to everyone during last season that he is on a trajectory to be an all-time great. He has the skill, the mentality, and the drive to do just that. And even at the age of 22, he is capable of being the guy on a team that can make a deep playoff run. That's impressive. I think he could be on a list like this into the future. While those two seem like the most likely candidates from this draft class to have a long-term legacy like this, there are others who could do this as well, though it doesn't seem super likely at the moment. While the 2019-20 draft class may not quite be as deep and strong as the 2018 class, there are still two names that stand out as being capable of eventually being on a list like this. The first to mention is Zion Williamson, who, by the way, I just discovered in China his nickname is translated as Fat Tiger. Zion's got the talent and the skill to someday make a list like this, but he's definitely got a long way to go. His early career made injuries seem like a really genuine concern, and though that seems to be affecting him a bit less as his career progresses, he's still got a lot to show and prove. His game has some amazing strengths, but it also has some very evident holes that he will need to work on. Someone who is not good at defense and is also not a good shooter really has to show some improvement before they could be able to reach a coveted list like the one we're considering. Zion has the potential, but those holes in his game are real. The next to consider is Ja Morant, and I would suggest that Ja actually has a better chance to eventually reach this list than does Zion. He has proven himself capable to be the guy that can lead a team, whether on the court or off of it. He has leadership capabilities and charisma, he has eyes in the back of his head, and when he plays the game, you just can't keep your eyes off of him. He's just so much fun to watch. I think the basketball card market has started to really realize Ja's upside, and though his cards oftentimes are valued a bit less than Zion's, I would not be surprised if he surpasses Zion's card value during this upcoming season. Zion is on a team who did bad last year, and they only got worse during the offseason. Ja, on the other hand, is on a young and exciting up-and-coming team, and with Jaren Jackson Jr. set to return from his long injury, I think the Grizzlies will be a team to watch this year. Could they pull off what the Hawks managed to pull off in the East last year? If anyone from the West could do that, it'd be Ja and his Grizz. Now, talking about the 2020-2021 draft class in this conversation is admittedly a little bit ridiculous. These players have only had one season in the league, and there really isn't enough evidence to pull from when considering a question like their long-term legacy. That being said, this video is trying to make these future projections, so let's do it for fun anyway. The first name to consider is certainly Lamelo Ball. I think he has a very good chance to be a future perennial all-star, especially with his fan-favorite flashy play. That being said, I actually think his basketball cards are currently overvalued. He's the best player from his draft class, I think, and I also think he'll have a long and successful career. I just worry that the hype is actually a bit too much on him. I'd much rather have some nice Ja rookies than LaMelo rookies myself. They feel like they'll be worth more a couple years down the road. That being said, I still like to hold on to any LaMelo rookies I can get my hands on if the price is right, because I do like his game and his future prospects. I find it interesting. I actually live in China, and I find that LaMelo Ball rookie cards are quite a lot cheaper here than they are in the US. You know, there's some players who are super popular here and that people see a lot of potential. Ja Morant's cards are quite expensive. Luka Doncic's cards are even more expensive here than they are in the US, actually, as surprising as that is. Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, and Michael Jordan cards are oftentimes more expensive as well. But the LaMelo Ball cards are really quite a lot cheaper. I picked up myself a lot of 6 LaMelo Ball Hoops rookie cards. I know it's just Hoops, but I picked up 6 of them for $4, was it? Plus shipping. So I think with shipping it came out to $6. So I got like 6 of them for $6. The next name to consider is Anthony Edwards. He's certainly got the necessary confidence to become a great, and his rookie year was really a very excellent rookie year. I actually think, while not as good as LaMelo, that Edwards' cards might be slightly undervalued. I have a feeling he'll be taking a big jump either next year or the year after that, and once his game has got that extra couple years of polish, I think he'll be a real force in the league. I don't think anyone else from this draft class has gotten themselves to the point yet where they should yet be talked about in this kind of conversation. I mean, neither really have LaMelo and Edwards, if we're being honest here, but at least there is a bit of a trajectory that seems to be emerging with those two. The rest, at the moment, seem unlikely for a list like this. Halliburton is maybe the third best so far, but though he could very well blossom into one of the more important guards in the league in a few years' time, any more than that is pretty big ask. With all that being said, that's all I have for you at the moment. Please subscribe to the channel for lots of great basketball and basketball card related content.